Welcome back to History H114, Western Civilization 2. If you've made it thus far, you've made it through the first lecture, or I should say series of lectures. And today we begin, in some ways, with the course, quote, unquote, more proper, even though that's based on periodization and chronology, which I've talked a little bit about last time, in terms of the Reformation. Because if we're looking at the origins of modern Europe, which essentially is what this course covers, the development from medieval to forms of modern concepts of Europe, Western civilization from the 15th or the 16th century almost to the present, we need to look at a series of transitions. And the major transition at the beginning of the course or period is something scholars have referred to as the Reformation. Now, the Renaissance was still ongoing, depending on how we want to define that. I've mentioned that a bit. I talked about that a bit, I think, in the previous lecture. But the Renaissance was an educational movement going back to the sources, trying to consider themselves as having recovering antiquity, etc. It was certainly not anti-Christian. The concept of humanism that is very current today, secular humanism, was not the humanism of the Renaissance. The Renaissance humanists were all very committed Christians. They just accepted Christianity as a given. And they were called humanists because they taught the humanities, disciplines in schools outside the universities, only slowly affecting the university curriculum. These were disciplines such as history, literature, ethics. Those were the three primary disciplines that were seen as the humanistic disciplines, or the humaniora, as they were also called. And these were begun in Italy in schools not associated with universities and also in private teaching, that then in the course of the later 15th century and on into the 16th century started affecting university curriculum and became slowly adopted therein. It was focused on Latin and Greek, and then north of the Alps, humanism as it progressed from Italy and moved north of the Alps, also on Hebrew, because these are the languages that were also very important for biblical interpretation. It's even been referred to, Northern humanism as it's called, humanism north of the Alps, as Christian humanism. And that did have an effect on the Reformation. It was, I can say a lot about the Renaissance, and I don't want to get waylaid already at the very beginning here. So we have 3 or 4 parts to this lecture as well. I hope to get it all done in one. I hope. But the Reformation is a period, or was a period, that did transform Europe in terms of restructuring power structures, the way Europe was being governed. And it was a series of events. There was no such thing as the Reformation. People have also talked about the age of Reformation, and I personally have less problems talking about the age of Reformation, whereby in 1500 there was certain structures in place, and by 1600 those structures had altered rather significantly. In general, um, I would consider this the period where we see the transition from the operating system. I believe I talked about that in the last lecture, from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. Now, the myth of the state or the nation state is the theme of the lecture for next time, the next subsequent lecture here. But it's very much part of this Reformation period because we see that emerging almost as a result of a lot of the conflicts that were involved in this very time of upheaval and conflict, civil war, almost wherever you look in Europe, there was periods of civil war. But we'll be talking about some of those as we go through. It's a very complex period, and many factors were involved. So often it's reduced to 1 or 2 factors, namely a theological aspect centered on Martin Luther, whereby Luther discovers the wonderfulness of the individual and his own conscience, and he can stand up over against the authority that was there and say, proclaim, here I stand, which is something he never said, but I'll get back to that later. But that is absolutely not the case. It's also not the beginnings of toleration. I think at the end of this lecture, part of that last slide from religionization to confessionalization, which I'll explain more when we get there, there's an issue of the end of toleration. Because early modern Europe was far less tolerant than was medieval Europe in terms of openness to variations in beliefs and thoughts and the lack of repression. Just for one example, the witch hunts, so to speak, were not medieval. They were early modern. They really only begin in the very late 15th century, but then it's in the course of the 16th century and on into the 17th century, that is the real high point of the witch craze. So in terms of acceptance, toleration, modernity, we like to think of ourselves as being more tolerant and individualism, whereby you can believe what you want. I may disagree with you, but you have the right to believe what you want, as long as you don't, interfere with other people, so to speak. That is an extremely recent development, that concept, and certainly was not there in this period, the Age of Reformations. And it should be really called the Age of Reformations because there were many different variables and patterns, not simply one cause that then led to a cascading effect in others. And we'll see how some of those developed in the course of this lecture. So I just wanted to set the stage for this lecture. I have probably a rather unique view of it all. And if you're interested more in my perspective, at least on Luther, I think I mentioned my book on Luther in last lecture, and I go into more of the detail there. I'm just going to try to hit some of the highlights here for you. Now, whatever anyone might say about the Reformation, or however you want to call it, we need to see, number one, I would say, it in continuity and continuation of what I have called the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, whereby in the early 16th century there had already been calls for reformation. There had been calls for reformation of individuals, of society, of government. There had been social upheavals with peasant revolts, and there was an expectation that something was coming. I think I mentioned the treatise, the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, where there was a prophecy that a reformer was coming. And I think I mentioned last time too, when John Huss was burned at the Council of Constance, he said, "You may burn this goose, but a reformer is coming you will not be able to put down. A swan is coming you will not be able to put down." So there's this expectation also connected with this concept of apocalypticism. The world is coming to an end. The world as we know it, what do we do about it? And that did continue. So we're having a very tense society and culture and period here, almost that all that was needed was a spark. And it opened everything up. And we're going to look at some of those openings up in this lecture on the Reformation. And we're going to begin then, therefore, as traditional in many ways, with a very central figure, no matter how you look at it, namely Martin Luther. So with that preface and introduction, we go to Brother Martin Luther Augustinian. Luther is a central figure, as a catalyst, if nothing else. We need to try to understand, though, that Luther was not a modern individual. He was a medieval individual, and yet stood kind of in that boundary between the Middle Ages and early modernity. Now, again, these are labels that historians use to describe a series of phenomena, both the medieval and early modern. How we describe them affects our understanding of them and our periodization. because there was no such thing as someone waking up um, all of a sudden getting the newspaper and saying, "Oh my God, we're now in early modern Europe. The Middle Ages are over. Yay!" It's not how it happened. Those are terms that scholars apply to things. But Luther was, first and foremost, in the beginnings, an Augustinian hermit, a member of a mendicant order, a religious order that had been established in 1256. Has been one of the most understudied of the orders. We think of the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Many people have heard of the Franciscans, the Dominicans. Fewer people. Sorry, I'm having a hard time speaking today. Far fewer people have heard of the Augustinian hermits, the order of hermits of St. Augustine. But it was an order that Luther joined in 1505, and he did so for a number of reasons. He was the son of Hans Luther, who was involved in the mining industry. He was a Schmelzmeister, responsible for actually processing the ore. So he was not actually in the mines, but he was one of those people who was processing the ore that came out of the mines and then was sold. The Luthers had been over the centuries working their way up in the social hierarchy, which in the Middle Ages, especially the later Middle Ages, there was some sort of mobility for families. Not as rapidly as today, certainly, but it was possible. And Hans Luther, um, had achieved a sufficient level of wealth. He was not a wealthy man, even by the times, but he was doing fine. And his son Martin, he recognized had a lot of ability in school, so he wanted to try to ensure that he had a very good education. He went to a number of different teachers in different places, and then went to the University of Erfurt for his bachelor's degree and then on for his master's degree. And for Hans, this was great. He was so proud of his son. He had not gone to university. And so he was hoping that by the means of education, his family could improve their lot in society even further. And law was a major means of doing so. And also it would help with family business. If you could have a lawyer in the family, he thought this would be great. We're all set here. And so after Martin received his Master of Arts, um, he was planning on going back to Erfurt to study law. And he had gone home to visit his parents, and on the trip back to Erfurt, which he's walking, this is before the time of cars and buses and trains, he was caught in a thunderstorm. And in the midst of this thunderstorm, a lightning bolt struck very nearby, throwing him to the ground, and he exclaimed, "Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk." There's been a lot of speculation on whether or not this is a true story, and then why he would call out to St. Anne. Well, St. Anne was the patron saint of miners, and technically Hans was a miner, even though, as I said, he wasn't someone actually digging in the mines, but he was part of the mining industry. And so Luther's calling out to St. Anne made perfect sense. Luther did not grow up and just all of a sudden become a member of the Augustinian hermits. Technically, he was not a monk. The hermits were hermits. They were mendicants, different type of religious order than the monastic monks order. But Luther referred to himself a monk, and by this time there is fluidity in the terminology, even though if there was a legal distinction, and I'm not going to get into all of those aspects here and now in any case. But why would someone do that? It's understandable that he was afraid, that he was worried, that he calls out for help, for divine help, intervention. But why make that vow? Now, it's impossible to get into his mind to know really what was going on, but it seems to me that it would be rather odd if he had made such a vow, if he had not already been thinking about it. wondering. We know that the Augustinian hermits were some of his teachers at the university in Erfurt. Some of he worked with very closely. They had a very good reputation as an academic order, as a rigorous order. Um, and so it does make sense, but it is still, even for the time, a bit out of the ordinary. Not everyone that was caught in a thunderstorm and was almost hit with a lightning bolt made a vow to become a monk if they would be saved, but Luther did. So he progressed on to Erfurt, and rather than going to law school, he knocks on the door of the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. And there he was asked, "What do you seek?" And he said, "I seek the righteousness of God and of yours." Now, this phrase of the righteousness of God, that was part of actually the ritual which we know in terms of accepting people into the order. When someone knocked and wanted to join the order, they would have to say, "What do you seek?" And Luther gave the proper response. They would have to then be certain and prove that they weren't running away for something, that they were actually free to join the order, that they weren't married, running away from a marriage, that they weren't um, in debt, that they weren't running from the law, that they weren't a convict. And it was determined that Luther was eligible to actually join, so he was brought in. He got to spend some time with them, and then he had a novitiate, a period of probation for a year, where he lived with them, was taught their ways before taking his final vows. And so his final vows came in 1506, where he pledged and made his vows and pledged to be obedient to God, the Virgin Mary, and the order, the general of the order. Those were part of his vows. He did not vow obedience to the Pope in any way, shape, or form. He vowed obedience to God, to Mary, to the general of the Augustinian hermits, and its representative under his prior Vinat. That's important for later on to keep in mind. His superiors in the order realized that he was intellectually very capable, and so they wanted him to start studying theology. They wanted him to become a priest. And so in 1507, he was ordained to the priesthood. His father was very upset. His father was not happy at all. His father did come to Luther's first Mass and brought gifts for the monastery, very much like a dowry. He wanted to show that he was a person of a certain financial standing. And afterwards, having celebration after his first Mass, Luther sat next to his father and Luther said, "See, Father, this is God's will that I became a hermit, an Augustinian hermit." And Hans was having none of it. He said, "Haven't you also heard that the devil can appear as an angel of light?" And I said, "Yeah, but I have to be, obedient to God." And Hans said, "Haven't you also read that you're supposed to honor your father and mother and be obedient to them?" Now, these two responses by Hans shook Luther. Luther's mental state, again, is something that we can't really get at, but we can speculate about. We know that he was searching for something. We know that he was extra scrupulous. To one point, his superior and also his confessor, Johann Staupitz in the order, said, "Martin, you don't need to confess all these little things that you're confessing. You know, God's not angry with you. You're angry at God." Luther later said, I used to hate the term the righteousness of God. I would view it as this just God who was going to punish me for being wrong, for making mistakes. Some ways, very much a father, a stern father figure. And he did have a stern father figure in Hans. Luther talked about being whipped as a boy at times when he got out of line. In terms of the standards of the day, there's no indication that Luther had an abnormal upbringing, but just a very stern upbringing with physical discipline, corporal punishment. And it could very well be that he had this father complex that he then projected onto the divinity. Now, we can speculate, and it's important to speculate, but we can't argue um, based on the evidence that that was indeed the case. But we can point to some of these aspects in terms of his father and his relationship with his father and what his father said, or at least was reported to have said, how that might have affected young Martin. But anyway, he started studying theology in 1509, and then by 1512 had received his doctorate in theology. There's all kinds of other issues there as well. It was a much shorter program of study than it had been in the 14th century by numerous years. And Luther became a doctor of theology very shortly after having become an Augustinian hermit himself. So there's this disjunction in some ways between being a theologian and being a member of the order. There was always a tension for Luther. He rose in the order very quickly. Already in 1515, he was made a district vicar, being in charge of 11 monasteries in terms of their discipline and oversight. And he complains about how busy he was. He was also then lecturing on the Bible at Wittenberg. So a number of these factors were all involved in terms of who he was and what he was doing. And there's no indication early on of much difference. But then something happened, and there was that spark that set everything off. And it has been called traditionally his Reformation breakthrough. This is a problem. Scholars have tried to identify precisely when this Reformation breakthrough occurred for Luther, almost since the 16th century itself. Was it the issue of indulgences, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly? Was it the issue of justification by faith, which Luther became very well known for? What was it, and when did it happen? Now, I can talk a lot about that and the importance historiographically, theologically, for understanding Luther and the whole movement thereafter, so to speak. I just want to point out a couple of things. One is that scholars, till kind of my book, basically, and that's still having its impact, I think, or hope in any case, in some ways gotten tired of trying to identify the moment of his breakthrough. And so they would have pointed out that there were a number of breakthroughs along the way. The problem here is that Luther talks about his breakthrough in his introduction to the first volume of his collected works in 1545, so just shortly before he dies in 1546. He says, I want to tell you about how it all started, because you should know some things if you read my works. I think they all should be burned, but I'm assuming they're not going to be. And so I at least want to set the record straight in terms of how this happened. He talks about the indulgences controversy, and he talks about his struggle with understanding Paul, Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 17 and 18, that the just man shall live by faith. Now, a couple of things. First of all, just, justus, justitia in Latin, can mean just. It can also mean righteous. Both of our terms are in that Latin word. And Luther talks about when he said he was so struggling to find out, to discern what did Paul mean. And he hated the righteousness of God. But then all of a sudden, boom, breakthrough. He saw that the righteousness of God was not something that was an active righteousness, but it was a passive righteousness. It was not the righteousness by which God judged us justly. It was the righteousness by which God made us just. I said, that just like threw open the gates of heaven. And then he said, he started going through all the scripture in his mind and seeing that all these attributes of God were all passive. They were things that God worked in us. And they say he went back to Augustine, Spirit in the Letter, one of Augustine's major works. And he said, against hope, I saw that Augustine actually interpreted it the same way. And that was the beginning of his breakthrough, theologically. Now, a couple of issues here. Dating this breakthrough based on his recollections from 1545, some 30 years later, is very problematic. The text itself is difficult to interpret because it works progressively backwards in time. He doesn't say, here's the beginning, then this happened, then this happened. He's saying, I am here, this is what I was doing. And he goes, well, before that was this, and before that was this, and this, and this, and then kind of gets around. It's very kind of convoluted. It's written very well, but just a convoluted structure, so it's difficult to understand exactly when this was. Again, I could go into a lot more detail on all of this, but I wanted to point out that this idea of the passive righteousness of God, passive justice, passive righteousness, that which we receive, Luther should have already known, because not only was it Augustine, it was also within the Augustinian order. And, for the most part, just the foundation of late medieval Augustinian theology. Luther seems to have been rather ignorant of the theological tradition of his own order. In 1516, 1516, so just as he's being made district vicar, he's lecturing on Romans, and already there, in 1515, he cites Augustine's On the Spirit in the Letter, precisely in this passive sense. Now, some scholars have said, oh, this tower experience, as it was called, his discovery, his breakthrough, didn't happen until 1518 at the earliest. But it's like, well, wait a minute, 1518? No, we see this in his commentary on Romans already in 1516. So how could it have been 1518? Because what they're doing is looking at a theological development rather than the historical development. And I can say a lot more about that. I can refer you to my book if you want to see the details. My point here, though, is that this theological discovery of Luther's, which for him was a personal discovery and of personal importance, was not his Reformation breakthrough. It was a theological breakthrough, maybe, but not a breakthrough to, quote unquote, the Reformation, whatever that might mean. Now, I mentioned already that he doesn't seem to know much about the theological tradition of his order. He was taught, the theology that he was taught, we know, was primarily from an individual by the name of Gabriel Biel, who was a secular priest. He was a member of the Brethren of the Modern Life, but that's a whole other issue. It's kind of a reform movement in the later Middle Ages. And Biel was one of the people he then had read and learned, also an earlier 14th century theologian and philosopher by the name of William of Ockham, who was a Franciscan. Luther actually referred to as my teacher, Magister Meus. It was Ockham. In 1517, in September of 1517, Luther wrote 98 theses against scholastic theology, his disputation against scholastic theology. And he refers to Biel and Ockham over and over again. He also refers to another Franciscan theologian, Duns Scotus, and a secular theologian, Pierre Dailly, of the early 15th century, and Gabriel Biel as these people who he is attacking. And he is claiming then that they represent all of medieval theology. Which is not the case whatsoever. There's no indication Luther had read much else. Little bits here and there. There is some evidence that he may have read some of one particular Augustinian theologian, Gregory Rimini, but seemingly did not read him very carefully or very thoroughly, because if he had, early on, he would have known that Gregory also espoused a passive righteousness. And so we know that Luther later started reading Gregory of Rimini and refers to him as the best interpreter of Augustine of the entire Middle Ages. Fine, wonderful, but at this early period, very little evidence. And I said 1517 in September. That's also then when the issue of indulgences is heating up. We'll see a lot more about that. In October 31st, 1517, Halloween, indeed, Hallow Eve, Luther posted 95 theses against indulgences. A couple of things. Indulgences had been a way to relieve princes in Europe from their responsibility to go on crusade. They had developed in the late 11th, early 12th century. If a prince said, I really don't want to go on crusade, can I get out of it some way? And the Pope said, well, you can if you pay for someone to go in your place, and then you can receive an indulgence from your obligation to go. Now, that's kind of the origins of indulgences. But that theory that someone could pay or do something in place for something else and therefore receive an indulgence from that first obligation became to applied to sin, or actually penance as such. If your penance was to go on pilgrimage, that was what had been the priest had said, well, what you did was so bad, you need to really go on a pilgrimage to St. James Compostela in Spain. So I really can't get away. I'm busy. Can I pay for something else? Well, I'll tell you what, if you pay or make a substantial contribution, financial contribution to the building of an altar in your local church, they're trying to get ready, will absolve you from the obligation to go on that pilgrimage. You'll receive an indulgence from that obligation. Now, I hope that's kind of clear in terms of the origins of it, but that theory of indulgences developed as almost an economic exchange, so that you could pay for good works so you wouldn't have to do them. You could pay for penance that you wouldn't have to do it, have somebody else do it, or simply have that monetary gift of giving something good, giving alms, giving charity as part of your penance. It was only in the later 15th century that the theory of indulgences developed even further, to the point where you could gain an indulgence not only for yourself, but also for somebody else, including souls in purgatory. Martin Luther was not the first person to complain about the abuse of indulgences. Not at all. It became a very common complaint, especially in Germany. Especially then when the Pope started using the preaching of indulgences, or the selling of indulgences, as a means to finance the new St. Peter's in Rome. The St. Peter's that is there still today was started in the late 15th century and on into the 16th century, and they needed a lot of money to build it. Now, there have been a number of proclamations of pronouncing indulgences, and this was based on the idea that there was something called the treasury of merit, that Christ, by his death and resurrection, had merited so much more than was needed to save everybody in the world. It's like this huge bank account. And the Pope was the banker and could distribute the funds as the Pope saw fitting. So the Pope could actually say, I'm going to proclaim an indulgence that needs to be preached, and for the funds received, we're going to use those funds for St. Peter's. And this is a little bit different than the example I gave early on in terms of making a major contribution to your local church in terms of the building of the new altar, whatever. This is all then going to Rome. The Germans especially were not happy. They viewed that they were being fleeced by the papacy. So there's a lot of animosity and tension here, which I'll get into more. So when Luther publishes these theses, he says, you know what? I don't like what's going on. We need to discuss this as theologians. He was a theologian. Academic debate, public academic debate was part of the academic uh, not only endeavor but requirements. Professors were required to hold these public debates every so often, and they had to announce them. Now, in the early 16th century, there's no internet. There's no way of saying, okay, we're going to have a disputation or debate on indulgences at 3:30 tomorrow in Kavanaugh Hall, room 235. Everybody come if you're interested. Doesn't work that way. You have to put up a notice. Now, we still have notices. I'm not sure. Any of you are not freshmen. You probably have had some time in the classrooms, in the hallways, and there's often flyers put up announcing things. So and so society is meeting, blah, 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 blah. Well, posting in the early 16th century a notice of an academic debate was kind of like posting a flyer today. Now, they didn't have set university buildings except for the common area for the university and the town was the university church. So Luther posted his theses on the door of the university church. Now, this posting of this thesis has been seen as this great act of defiance. That it was certainly not. It was simply making notice that tomorrow we're going to be debating these theses in Latin. They're all in Latin. Because we theologians needed to deal with this issue of indulgences. Well, these theses, they were seen, thought, oh, this is cool, this is great. Were taken up, translated into German, and spread throughout Germany very quickly. We'll talk more about that again shortly. So all of a sudden, this was the spark that set everything off. There was nothing original in Luther's critique as such. This was not his Reformation breakthrough, the indulgence problem. I'll be coming back to the indulgence shortly. But what happened as a result is Luther got himself in a lot of trouble. At first, the Pope didn't really care much. It was like, oh, here's another squabble between monks. The Pope was Leo X by this time, a Medici, part of the very, very wealthy Medici family in Italy, Florence. And so the Pope didn't take notice, especially because he had bigger concerns on his hands. What were they? Well, 1518, just as the notoriety of Luther's theses was spreading like wildfire, the Emperor Maximilian, died. Problem, we need a new Holy Roman Emperor. So I already said, I think last lecture, that is an elected office. Now, the closest living relative to Maximilian was his grandson, Charles, who was King of Spain. He was only 15 years or 16 years old. No, 18 years. He was born in 1500. So he was 18 at the time. He became King of Spain when he was 16, 15, 16. Which he inherited it through his mother and his father. And he was from the same family, the Habsburg family. Maximilian was a Habsburg. Charles, Spain was a Habsburg. He was Charles I, King of Spain. And together with Spain, and he had inherited through his mother the Low Countries, Netherlands and Belgium, a good chunk of that. And the Habsburgs' family territories were Austria, and the Pope said, my God, we cannot let Charles be emperor. Now, keep in mind, this is already after the theses are spreading, or while they're spreading. The Pope approached Francis I, the young, brash King of France. Said, Francis, how about you run for emperor? He said, I would love to run for emperor. So, okay, we'll think about this. But the problem there was France and the members of the empire, the Germans, again, there's no such thing as Germany, but there are the Germans, German-speaking lands and territories, cities, princes, counts, dukes, and stuff, was not very friendly with France. And somehow the Pope realized he wasn't going to be able to pull off getting all the electors to vote for the King of France. And remember the electors, I talked about it last time, determined to be the seven largest princes in the empire. King of Bohemia, Duke Palatinate, Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia, and then the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. They're not going to vote for a Frenchman. He also thought, well, how about this English king, young English King Henry VIII? How about you being emperor? I'd love to be emperor. I can't really pull it off. So the Pope even then approached Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise. Said, Frederick, tell you what, you're not a Habsburg. How about you run for emperor? I will bankroll you. I'll support you over against Charles. I don't want Charles to be emperor. And Frederick said, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not really interested. Frederick has been called the Wise, and not without reason, because he knew better than to run for emperor in that case, so to speak. So lo and behold, Charles was elected after all. And the Pope is like, oh my God, now what am I going to do politically? Now, he even made an offer to Frederick the Wise to say, I'll tell you what I'll do. Not only will I bankroll your thing, you can name anybody you want to be cardinal. That's a big thing. Have a cardinal in your pocket. And Frederick even turned that down. Now, why is this so important? Because Luther was gaining a lot of notoriety. Luther was teaching at the University of Wittenberg by this time. And because of this controversy, the University of Wittenberg was becoming famous, and Luther was becoming famous. And Frederick the Wise had established the University of Wittenberg in 1502. It was his university, and his most famous professor, he could have named cardinal. Pope knew that. He didn't really care. Frederick still said no. Charles becomes emperor in 1519, and it's okay. Now we got to do something about this indulgence issue. And the Pope's not all that happy with Frederick anyway, so he sends a couple of envoys to go talk to Luther. Wants him to recant, go back and forth. And it begins to be a real heated up controversy over this issue of indulgences and whether or not this Dominican monk or friar who was preaching the indulgences, Johannes Tetzel, was accurate. He was going around saying, for every coin that in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. What? You don't want to get out of purgatory yourself? Okay, well, what about your mother? No, I can't stand my mother. She can stay in purgatory. Okay, well then, how about your daughter? Your baby daughter who died, who's suffering in purgatory. That's the kind of sales pitch he would use. Now, there was a varying scale, so if you were more wealthy, you had to pay more than if you were poor. But still, they were fleecing the flock, so to speak. And that's what Luther objected to. Now, the Pope gets involved, says, this is wrong. Okay, Martin, you have to recant. Will you recant? And Martin at one point said, well, if we can just agree that these indulgences are not being preached right. He didn't even say I'm against indulgences as such. He's just saying this types of preaching of them is wrong. He goes, I would recant. Yeah, okay, fine. Not a big deal. The issue is on the indulgences. Now, in his thesis against indulgences, one of the things that Luther attacked in his theses, to be debated, was the power of the Pope and whether the Pope could actually release souls from purgatory. And that had been an ongoing debate, actually. Augustinus of Ancona, I may have mentioned him, I'm not sure, in the last lecture. But in his comprehensive treatment of papal power, he even said, can the Pope free all souls from purgatory? He said, absolutely, he has the power to do that, but he would err if he did. So that concept was still there, always held in check. But Luther then is putting it forward here as denying that the power even existed. So his theses were seen as an attack on the power of the papacy, which is not what Luther was intending, but was there implicitly. I'll say a lot more about that here as well. In short, Luther was getting himself in more and more trouble. The Pope then demanded that he be brought to Rome, sent to Rome. for trial. Frederick the Wise and some of the other German princes said, wait a minute, no, we're going to deal with this. This is a German matter. We're going to deal with it on German territory. Have the emperor decide. Okay? We're not going to send him off to Rome. This is just the Italians fleecing and lording it over the empire and the Germans. That tension that was ongoing. So Frederick arranged that Charles would hear Luther's case in 1521 at a meeting of the imperial legislature, the Reichstag. Luther's still not been excommunicated yet. He was getting very close. In 1520, in February of 1520, though, he made two discoveries that shocked him. With the heating up of the controversy, one of the things he did was go back and read Huss, the works of Huss, especially his treatise on the church. Now, Luther grew up knowing Huss was a heretic. He even has letters when he started being acclaimed by the papal envoys and things that he was a Hussite. He said, absolutely not. Huss is a heretic. I will never be a Hussite. I will never be a heretic. I'm a loyal member of the church. But he started reading Huss. And he writes a letter to the top advisor of Frederick the Wise, Georg Spalatin, the secretary, right-hand man, with whom Luther was very close. Not so much with Frederick himself, but with Spalatin he was. He said, my God, Huss was right. I can't believe this. Huss was right. He said, we're all Hussites, to the letter. I'm a Hussite. Staupitz, my advisor, head of the order in Germany, is a Hussite, but so is Augustine, and so is actually the Apostle Paul. We're all Hussites. And this was condemned, and Huss was burned in public. What the hell are we going to do with this? It was a shock. A big shock. And then a week later, he writes again. Says, oh my God. The Pope is the Antichrist. Now I see it. We have to mobilize. This was the beginning. Two things. One, the other discovery was, I think it was Huss, and also then the donation of Constantine. The donation of Constantine was a document that was forged in the 8th century. Supposedly, in this document, the Emperor Constantine gave temporal jurisdiction and rule of the West to the Pope. Now, neither the papacy nor the Emperor ever gave the donation of Constantine much thought. Marsilius of Padua, back in this political conflict and theory between Marsilius of Padua and Augustinus of Ancona and the Augustinians, so, question its authenticity. So, but yeah, but if it's true, then obviously the emperor can take it back too, and the Pope doesn't really have any authority whatsoever. Augustinus said, well, it's probably not valid either, but, if it is valid, what it shows is that Constantine was actually the first legitimate emperor because he recognized that the authority and power was actually the Pope's to begin with. He was just returning what was already the Pope's. So two different positions. Luther seems to have been unaware of that. And when he read that the donation of Constantine was a forgery, that was the last straw for him. So it was first Huss, the donation of Constantine. And this was a treatise the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla in the 15th century had written, had spread around to his friends, showing and proving that this document could not have been composed in the 4th century. It was a forgery and a product of the early 8th century or 7th, 8th century, which is basically where scholars say it was now, and therefore undermined, in Valla's mind and some people's mind, the whole basis for papal temporal authority, which, as I said already, by the theorists who knew better, didn't at all as such. But it certainly would be an embarrassment. But Luther reads this and thinks that it is the basis of papal power, which it had not been, but Luther viewed that it was, and then to see that it was a forgery. He read it in a new medium, not the manuscript itself, but a German humanist actually had found it and had it printed. He did an edition of it and had it printed and was spreading it around. And that is what Luther read. And he thought, oh my God, this shows it. The Pope is the Antichrist. Now, popes have been called Antichrist before. John the 22nd, back in the 14th century, was called an Antichrist. Luther sees it something different. For Luther, it's not just the Pope, it's the papacy. The very institution is Antichrist. St. Peter's throne is not the throne of Peter that then the Antichrist was sitting on. It is the very throne of Antichrist. And that's when he goes on the attack. And he writes his famous 3 treatises in 1520, Freedom of a Christian, Babylonian Captivity, and on the freedom of the will. Or the bondage of, on the bondage of the will. His famous 3 treatises of 1520. And only after that, in which he explicitly attacks the papacy, even after that, the Pope says, you've gone too far. He writes to the Pope saying, here, you'll see I'm right. Read it. Read my theses. You'll see I'm right. Here's my treatises. You'll see I'm right. The Pope says, no, you have to recant. And the bull threatening excommunication comes down in December of 1520. And the German princes resist it. Because they say, no, we're going to deal with this in German soil. It is, though, this discovery, twofold discovery. First, that he's a Hussite, as it's always been, and that Huss was then condemned. The official church condemned Huss. And then the donation of Constantine was a forgery. That constituted his Reformation breakthrough, because that was what flipped. We no longer find discussions of, oh, I'll recant if you just see that I'm right about some things. Okay. Yeah. That brings us to the third point here, is Frederick the Wise, the father of the Reformation. And just as a note, I will try to get through this, and I may then stop here and then do a part 2 again. But this is important on getting some of the structures. Okay. I have there Frederick the Wise, the father of the Reformation. Why? Because Frederick the Wise protected Luther. Frederick the Wise was the elector of Saxony. I already mentioned that the Duke of Saxony was one of the 7 electors. In the later 15th century, there were 2 brothers, Ernest and Albert. And the duchy was split between the 2 brothers over, inheritance and issues, rather than just going to the other one. They fought about it. And the agreement that was made was that Albert would retain the title of Duke and get half of the duchy. And Ernest would get the other half and would be called the elector, so that Albert would be Duke, but could not elect the emperor, whereas Albert could elect the emperor, but that would be his only title, the Elector of Saxony. Frederick the Wise was the Elector of Saxony, not the Duke of Saxony. Frederick the Wise was also skeptical about Tetzel and the indulgences. He had one of the largest relic collections in Europe. I could talk a lot about that, but the whole point was there's issues here. So he banned Tetzel from coming in and preaching the indulgence in Ernestine, or electoral Saxony. But Wittenberg was close enough to ducal Saxony, or Albertine Saxony, that the parishioners of Luther would just go across the border and get indulgences and come back, and that was one of the conflicts. Frederick the Wise had arranged then to keep the Luther case within Germany. So at the Reichstag in 1521, Luther is called. Now, here's another problem. In response to the excommunication, because the Reichstag wasn't held till June. So we have from December 1520 until June 1521, this period of acrimony, fighting back and forth, and Luther gets more radical and radical. He calls for a church council against the Pope. Now, that had already been condemned. I talked about last time conciliarism, and how Pius II in 1462 in his bull Execrabilis condemned any calls to a council over the Pope in the wake of conciliarism, reasserting papal authority. And here, Luther was doing that, appealing to a council over the Pope, which just pissed off the Pope even further. So when they finally dealt with it, the young Emperor Charles was presiding. They brought Luther in. Luther knew he was going to die. What happened at Constance? The emperor said, Master Huss, just come to Constance. I will give you safe conduct. Didn't work. The emperor said, come to the Reichstag. I will give you safe conduct to the Reichstag. Luther knew his goose was cooked, or his swan was cooked, so to speak. But he goes. Now, the Reichstag in 1521 in Worms, the Diet of Worms, as it's called. Diet just means the meeting of the Reichstag, and Worms is the city where it met, the German city. They had numerous other issues to deal with. The Luther's not the only one to deal with, and part of on the agenda too was a series of grievances the princes and some of the cities within the empire were presenting, which also attacked indulgences and everything else. There was not people weren't happy with what was going on. Luther, though, arrives. He was expecting a debate. He was his works that he had published so far were put out before him, and he was asked whether or not they were his. And he says, "Yeah, those look like mine. These were pamphlets, sermons, commentaries on scriptures, etc." And then he was asked, "Will you renounce them? Will you recant what you've said here?" He said, "What? Well, can I go through them and I can pick out and show you what maybe I'd be willing to get rid of or to step back on?" And they said, "No, all or nothing." Well, I went to think about this. So he goes away to think about it. Comes back the next day. Says, "You know what? Since you give me no choice, it's all or nothing. Unless you can show me where I am wrong based on Scripture, I will not and I cannot recant. So help me God. Amen." The phrase, "Here I stand," was a later addition, much later 16th century addition to that account. The best we can tell of what Luther said was, it's be a wrong to go against my conscience. He says that. But that was a medieval moral principle. It was always more sinful to go against your conscience, even if your conscience was wrong, because your conscience is that last spark of feeling in your gut where you know that's not right. And that can be wrong. But if you act against that, you're acting against that very kind of divine spark within you. So even if it's erroneous and wrong, to act against your conscience is a greater sin than the sin that you may have committed otherwise. So Luther's appealing to conscience was not some modern individual thing. It was a medieval principle that he's appealing to. It's a sin to go against my conscience. Therefore, if you can't show me from Scripture where I'm wrong, in what particular doctrines where I am wrong, it would be a sinful, and so I cannot and I will not recant. God help me. Amen. Resigning himself to the pyre to be burned as a heretic, seeing that it was just like with Huss, which he knew. Emperor Charles, shook his head to Brother Martin. "How can you alone be right and 1,000 years of church tradition be wrong? Therefore, you are condemned as a heretic. Your books are to be confiscated and burned. You are to be captured and sent to Rome to be tried for heresy." I said, "Okay." Prepared to leave to make his way back to Wittenberg, packs up and starts the journey back, walking again. On the way back, walking back to Wittenberg, all of a sudden he hears horses coming behind him, armed men, and they snatch him up and kidnap him. Put a hood over his head so he doesn't know where he is or where he's going. And when he finally arrives, he's in a castle called the Wartburg. It's a castle owned and controlled by Frederick the Wise, Luther's prince. Luther escaped burning because Friedrich the Wise protected him. Said, no, we're not going to do this. What's called the Edict of Worms, the proclamation of the emperor condemning Luther, then became the point of contention. The imperial policy was that the Edict of Worms had to be enforced. It had to be enforced. It was the imperial decree. So if there were princes or cities that said, we're not going to enforce this decree, they were in opposition to the emperor. That was Frederick the Wise's position. He stood up, as did others as well, against the imperial decree, saying we're not going to enforce the Edict of Worms. Kidnapped had already prearranged, saving Luther, putting him in a place where no one knew. Even Luther's colleagues back in Wittenberg had no idea where he was or what had happened. They were worried. When I say Frederick the Wise is the father of the Reformation, that's really what I'm getting at. His courage to stand up against the emperor, to stand up against the pope, and to preserve and save Luther. And Frederick was not alone. He was not the only prince or political force that was doing so. There was a group of them. That story is what I'll get to in the next lecture, because I am going to end this here and have a part 2, which I will get to, I hope, shortly. And with part 2, we'll start with the third slide, which is the printing revolution, which played in all of this as well. So, into part 1. Stay tuned. Part 2 coming shortly. Alrighty. See you soon.